So, as I mentioned in the previous video, I'll be starting a 6-part series on the Agnostic Inquirer, Revelation from a Philosophical Standpoint. This book, which is by Sandra Menson and Thomas D. Sullivan, is about the presumption of natural theology. The presumption that they claim is that God needs to be demonstrated before looking at Revelation. As William Alston, from another book, explains, once we get that foothold, we may seek to show that a being could not have the initial attributes without also possessing certain others. In this manner, we try to go as far as we can. And this is in his book, Perceiving God, on page 289. Such a presupposition is also espoused by John Henry Cardinal Newman, Norman Kretzmann, and many others. And so this book is about challenging that presumption, and it argues that we can look into the existence of God by looking at Revelation. As well as arguments. As the book is sympathetic to agnostics, it starts by laying out the land. I don't think the first two sections are that important, and so I'll be starting with the third section. The first two problems that they outline is that the agnostic might desire a certain outcome over another. They might desire that God exists or that God doesn't exist, and so this runs the risk of, biases and accepting a claim without sufficient evidence. And so maybe the solution is to be indifferent to outcome. But however, as the people in the book explain, indifference to outcome undermines the pursuit of truth. Right? If you don't care about whether God exists or God doesn't exist, then what was the point in even pursuing the truth in the first place? There's no reason to do that. As the book explains, the admonition not to care about the truth of a revelatory claim requires investigators to start thinking along the lines of, it makes no difference whether there is a God who loves me. If you accept that there is a difference whether there is a God who loves me, then you can't be indifferent to outcome. And so that is not feasible. Furthermore, there are some desires we just cannot abandon. Right? All humans desire the good for themselves, and you can't really abandon that. And if we think that God brings about that good for us, then we can't really abandon that desire. At least without significantly changing our worldview and our personality, I guess. The second problem that they outline is rigidity. Right? What if you're so rigid on the evidence needed for a revelatory claim that you just don't accept any of them? You reject all of them as outlandish, based on the fact that they're just they're miraculous claims, and so they seem just outlandish. And so, while it is good to value common sense, in science and math, there has been some cases where common sense, or devaluing common sense, leads to some good outcomes. Right? For example, in Cantor's theory, once you accept that a one-to-one correspondence leads to equivalent size sets, you get all sorts of weird stuff. And also, when you look into science, you also see lots of weird stuff, as I'm sure many scientists will tell you. But those are theoretical concerns, right? How about practical considerations? Well, consider that the good in our lives, incomplete and transient as they are, do not fully satisfy us. And although there are loads of ethical systems, Stoicism, Aristotelians, Epicureans, etc., they don't lead to a deep satisfaction that we're looking for. And furthermore, there are naturalistic ethical systems that are just contradictory, and there's no satisfactory resolution for this. We can't seem to find a way to fix it. For example, the axioms that a utilitarian accepts will just be simply rejected by the consequentialist, right? If you do see them as opposing each other. After going on this, they decide to discuss many of the arguments attempting to undermine natural theology. The first one is Kantian arguments. So, Kant's objection was to theoretical reason for God, right? Things like Aristotelian reasons, based on demonstrations and not probabilistic arguments. However, consider that he made an argument for God based on practical reason. And so not all arguments are out of the picture, right? Moral arguments are just not out of the picture. Furthermore, this book is not focused on an argument based on deduction for a maximally real being. Rather, it's for a supernatural being, which is a much weaker claim. And it proceeds to show that if there is a supernatural being, then we can investigate the revelation and see whether it is plausible, whether a real God exists. The other sort of objection, or the more broad objection that he has, is toward metaphysics in general. And, there's lots of debate over what he means in his objections and antinomies and so on and so forth. But one of his objections involves a reductio ad absurdum. And and basically, this presupposes the principle of non-contradiction that applies to the world of noumena. And so the principle of non-contradiction, if it applies to noumena, means that we can know some things about it. One might object that the principle of non-contradiction is a semantic principle and not an ontological principle. But as Aristotle explained, this makes just no sense. And as Kant made an argument for God based on practical reason, based on morality, and deducing that the source of this must be some sort of divine being, there is a possibility of inferring the structure of the unseen from practical principles, such as causality. In such a manner, we can proceed with arguments for God, right? Another sort of thing, and this I find a lot more interesting, is the Wittgensteinian contentions. So, there's an argument made by Norman Malcolm, who is a pretty well-known Wittgenstein-influenced philosopher of religion, which goes as follows. 1. General frameworks are beyond question or criticism. 2. Religious beliefs are the parts of general frameworks, and thus religious beliefs are beyond question or criticism. So, what the book says is that premise 1 seems implausible. The principle of a non-contradiction can be debated, right? As you can see in Aristotle's Metaphysics, he goes on a transcendental argument for the principle of non-contradiction. And also, science should not be banished from the realm of religion entirely, right? If we accept that the general frameworks of religion are just beyond question, yet they contradict science, that doesn't seem to do very well. Also consider that this argument does not lead to fideism about God, right? Or that God is beyond question. Because Buddhists don't purport to believe in God. And so we can still be in this general framework and also look to see whether God exists or not. And so there's also another argument from Wittgensteinian contentions, which goes as follows. 1. There is no such thing as a belief in God apart from practicing worship. And then, so on premise 2, then religious beliefs cannot be evaluated apart from acts of worship. I guess this is kind of like a conclusion rather than a proposition or premise. The book says that premise 1 is false because, well, if you look into Christianity, for example, some of the beings believe in God, like, Satan himself believe in God, but they don't worship him, right? And so it does seem that belief in God is apart from practicing worship. And also there is a contention that God is not a hypothesis, but this also seems highly implausible, right? For many considerations. And also, like, the main one is that faith without risk is just faith without content, and faith without content is not much at all. So then, how about science? Well, this is a pretty new claim, but consider that consciousness, right, or questions like why is there anything at all, are not really answered by science, regardless of what you do, right? These questions are still running in the 21st century. Furthermore, and what I find even more interesting, is that the definition of physical is really tough to find, actually. Loads of the definitions are just not plausible, right? And the book goes into a lot of that. Either the definition is just too broad and it allows for many divine explanations, or it's too narrow so it doesn't allow its own theories to be, well, accepted. And furthermore, scientific explanations are not anti-theistic, merely non-theistic. They're agnostic on supernatural beings. And now, here's the main part. So, what is the general problem with an ontology? The general approach is to prove God before looking at revelation. So, this leaves agnostics with insufficient tools to deal with certain questions, such as the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, etc. So consider, for example, Plantinga's free will defense against the problem of evil. So consider proposition G, God, or God exists, and proposition R. It was not within God's power to create a world containing a better balance of good and evil than our world contains, and God creates a world with as much good and evil as our world contains. Now, to a theist, this might seem not contradictory or compassible. However, to an agnostic, this might not seem as so, right? They might object that, well, if this is the best that they can do, why would God create at all? Or stuff like that. And the book goes into another sort of defense from Van den Wagens, and a similar sort of situation follows. So, and as a lot of philosophers or theists accept, it seems that the only way to evil that which evil can be compatible with God is if there is compensation in the afterlife. Right? If you have a bunch of people that just suffer for no compensation at all, that doesn't seem good at all. It just seems just like completely pointless. And so Stump, Swinburne, Hick, Walls, and McCord-Adams all think that the answer to the problem of evil involves the possibility of post-mortem survival. However, it's difficult to give a philosophical argument for the possibility of post-mortem survival. I mean, consider Cajetan, for example. He went back and forth on whether Aquinas' argument for it was sound. And also, Aquinas deduces to a sort of like vegetative state after death, and then used revelation to get to further conclusions. Vegetative state has no compensation whatsoever, so like, it doesn't really work. So, let's go back to the presupposition. The presupposition is that one cannot obtain a convincing philosophical case for a revelatory claim without first obtaining a probable case for a good God, a case that renders the proposition more probable than not. However, this proposition is not presupposed by the majority of inquirers. I highly doubt that Aquinas believed in this, for example, or let's say Scotus, or Augustine, etc., and also more modern, in a more modern era, C.S. Lewis. Because if you remember his argument where you either accept that Jesus was divine or that he was a lunatic or a liar, and that sort of thing, and that does not presuppose P, or this proposition. And more importantly, there are counterexamples to this presupposition, which render it false. For example, consider that astronomers, back in the days, determined that the statement, "There is a heavenly body beyond Uranus, and there is a heavenly body beyond Uranus that is perturbing its orbit simultaneously," right? They first observed that there must have been a sort of disturbing force beyond Uranus, and then concluded that these two are true. They concluded it simultaneously. And also, there's another case. So you have a letter that says the author is willing to die for you. I mean, surely you would not be investigating the truth by just looking at all the different people in the world and seeing whether each one would be willing to die for you. Rather, you would look at the letter, right? And you look at the letter and determine the truth of the more complex proposition that this author is willing to die for you, and the more basic proposition that there is someone in the world willing to die for you at the same time, even though one is, well, less probable than the other. They can be more believable. And so yeah. So what's next? In the later chapters, there will be attempts to show that if it is not highly unlikely that a creator exists, then revelatory claims might render it probable that a good God exists, and thus investigations into revelatory claims are needed in order to justify in not believing in God. So this is directly against natural theology. And so they will investigate secular equality, inalienable rights, problem of evil, arguments to show that a creator is not highly unlikely, etc.